And yes, and John has turned on captions. So if you'd like to turn on the captions in Zoom and see them while we present, that'll be a great experience to see what that's like. And thank you for coming, Andrew. So we might go to the next slide, John. So I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country. The University of Queensland acknowledges the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. And we also recognise that the countries on which we teach have always been a place of learning. And on your screen is sorry, if we just go back, John, sorry. So on your screen is a map of some culturally significant sites on the UQ campus. So there's some bush tucker gardens and all sorts of great places to look at. And you can, sorry, I'll send that to everyone in the meeting. So I've just pasted a link in the chat. So that's from a Campuses on Countries report that came out a few years ago. And it's some lovely photos and some lovely background about some of the research that went into how we can make our campuses more culturally well designed. So next slide, please, John. So we'll start with some of the rules. So cameras on or off, it's up to you. Please remain muted unless speaking. And if you do want to raise your hand to speak, please do so. And as we go, feel free to contribute to the discussions on chat and use the chat for questions. And as for tools, it's pretty simple today. We'll just use Zoom chat, Zoom reactions, and Padlet. And we won't have any breakout rooms, so we won't have anyone running away when we open those up. Next slide, please, John. So the aims of the session today, we're using this know, do, be framework that Linda introduced us to. By the end of the session, we hope that everyone in the room will know the broad idea behind Universal Design for Learning, the idea that we design for as many people as we can. And hopefully we'll all know the existing services and resources to help us make our classes more inclusive and reduce the need for adjustments. What we'll be doing is experiencing a lesson plan that models inclusive practice by implementing UDL principles and share our own practice, fresh ideas, and learn from what our colleagues are planning. And hopefully by the end of this, we'll all be thinking about participation as a skill to be developed and a role to be inhabited rather than a state of being, and we'll have an inclusive design mindset and feel more confident making improvements. Next slide, please, John. So big picture, what's this all about? Why are we all here? The University Disability Action Plan requires that by Q4 next year, we use universal design principles considered when designing our curricula. But it's important to state here that we're not, we're already part of the way there, right? We've already got accessible library resources. We have accessible teaching recordings. We've got acoustic learning spaces that have sound loop for hard of hearing students. And we have access to colorblind safe PowerPoint templates. And we've all been, for most of us, very few of us just stand in front of a lecture theatre now and talk to students. We're doing active learning, which increases participation and inclusion. And the important thing is it sounds like a really difficult thing to do, but even small improvements can reduce the need for SAPs and stress on everybody. Now it's a big topic, and today we're just focusing on small improvements to improve inclusivity. And what we're planning to do is in Teaching and Learning Week in November, we'll we'll soup up a bit more and go a bit more in depth into refreshing our courses with Universal Design for Learning. Next slide, please, John. So who are all these people? We've got a lot of people today. There's me, I'm the Master of Ceremonies today. Then we're going to John, who's going to go through the survey results. Amber, I'm from HASS, I should have said. John's is a learning designer from School of Economics. Amber's my colleague in HASS. She's going to be doing myth busting, disability things about our UQ students. And Linda is going to go through some participation techniques. And then we'll go back to John. He'll be talking about Universal Design for Learning. Just going to admit a few people, sorry. And then we'll hand over to Jason from the library, who's our accessibility guru. And hopefully Lockie is joining us for our Q&A at the end. Next slide, please, John. So that slide was interesting in a way because it had an intentionally, probably the first of a number of intentionally questionable decisions. It didn't have a very clear list of what we're covering today. So I've just in chat, I've typed an ordered list, which is probably a better way of presenting that, and less cognitive load for students. We just finished having a session of student experiences of 2023 hosted by Dom, which was great. And I've just got a bit of a summary here. Some of the highlights that I came across was that students really want to know why their learning is relevant. So session outlines and what you'll be learning is a really good thing to have in your presentations or your lessons. Sharing your passion, icebreakers are liked, creating a safe space is important. And, there's a love for experiential learning, but there was mention about how the recordings do allow for those captions and a choice of playback speed. And I love the concept of brain breaks. I think that's really important. Next slide, please, John. And over to you.
Thank you, Chris, and good morning, everyone. Welcome. Survey went out on Friday morning to find out who was attending today. So these are the results as of 9:30 this morning. So we could see that most of us born here in Australia, and as far as we know, English is our first language. A variety of roles. Obviously, some people here can select more than one role. They play more than one role. We have almost an even split between full-time and part-time colleagues. And this question here about how much time is spent on student access plans each semester. So a variety here from 10 hours all the way down to hard to say, hard to put a number on it, which could well be more than 10. This question here, in terms of finding out how much pre-knowledge you have of Universal Design for Learning, we have a reasonable spread here, suggesting that overall, there's some knowledge and you'd like to find out more in this session. And this question was posed, trying to find out what ways can we make learning inclusive for you in this session. So I won't read all those out, but there is quite a variety of thoughts there. So you can see that different colleagues have come looking for different angles on Universal Design for Learning, and we will try and cover as many of those as possible. And then the final question is, how do you like to participate in your learning? And once again, we have a variety here. We have some people who've mentioned they really like the active learning. We like people who, we have people who like to sit and think about things and self-reflect. Some people prefer to listen, not keen on breakout groups. We're not doing breakout groups in this session. So a whole range here. And the purpose of this activity is really to find out who our learners are, how does it inform our teaching, and you can simply do the same sort of activity next week, an orientation week, where you can put out a simple survey like I did on Friday. Other ways you could do it is through a Padlet. I've seen that used in several courses where the course coordinator asks a little bit about the students, and it can include other things like hobbies and icebreakers and what movies you like to go and see, etc., which builds that sense of belonging as well. And another way you can do this is through the Ed Discussion tool in Blackboard. So if you're not familiar with Ed Discussion, it's a relatively new tool in Blackboard for discussion, which is much better than the discussion tool in Blackboard itself. And it can be used in ways where you can basically, through chatting to the students, ask them how they would like to engage in your course. So that's our first tip for next week, is ask the students, what would they like to see? How would they like to engage? How would they like to participate in your course? So we're moving on now to Amber, who's our resident myth buster. So over to you, Amber.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Chris. And also thank you to all the participants who engaged in that survey. It was actually really insightful. It's really a simple task, but I got a lot out of just reading those comments. So thank you. I hope you consider that for your classes. I'll be starting today by in fact, can we go back a slide? Yeah, I was going to ask the participants, invite them to contribute in the chat. What is the average student? We all have an average student in mind. Often we think of the average student as someone a bit like ourselves and our experience of university. We often start from our own experience. So when we're designing for our learning or designing our courses, who is usually in mind? Or you might just, what is that myth of the average student? Who is that student? For example, we think of the school leaver. What are some of those other? And if you could share that in the chat. Great. Yeah, thank you. Average grades, 5s. Yeah, exactly. Luke, thank you. Fabulous. Yeah, I think the school leaver is definitely the one that comes up the most. Thanks, everybody. But of course, we know from your own teaching experience that there's much more diversity. So if I'll get Chris or John to move on to that amazing diagram from ADSET. These are just some of the things we might consider in terms of the diversity in our classroom. And I think there's even more that have come up on the chat around things like grades and what students' goals are, what they're hoping to achieve. Something else I think that's really important to consider is that students, this will change from class to class or year to year. So even the same student will not always have the same learning experience or the same learning need. from class to class. It's really diverse. Also, hopefully it's not overwhelming. Sometimes we just have to start somewhere. And we'll be unpacking some of that today. We can't possibly meet all of these needs or be aware of all of these needs all of the time, but we can make an effort to get to know who's in our classroom and make some adjustments as we go. So let's move on to some more deep thinking about that. We're going to do a short activity and then one more click, please. Thank you, Master of Ceremonies. So we're going to use the reactions function for this, and then we'll get some reflections on how effective that is as a tool after. I'm going to have a number of statements on the screen and I'll read them out as well. The options are to tick the green yes reaction for true, the red cross reaction for false, or in reality that may be more complicated than that and you can look for another emoji that's appropriate. I know there's a coffee option, so I was suggesting the coffee reaction if you think, well, maybe it's a little bit more complicated than that, Amber. And I'll also invite you to share your thoughts in the chat if you like. We won't spend a lot of time on this activity, but if you're a quick typer, feel free to share some of your thoughts in the chat as we go. So we're going to do a practice activity. And the activity is my first question, which is, where is everybody zooming in from today? So green tick if you're on campus at one of the UQ campuses. And this is just to check we're all confident with the tool. Red cross if you're zooming from off campus today. And maybe a coffee emoji or some other kind of emoji if you're zooming in from a bus or some other interesting location like that. We all know students do that. Yeah, we've got, and again, if you're having trouble finding the reaction function or you're working off a small screen, you can simply use the chat to participate as well. That's totally fine. Great, looks like most of us have found that function. Awesome. Oh, we've got a diverse mix of on campus and off campus, so that's helpful. Thank you. So we'll move to the first statement, and I'll get, is it you, Chris, who's being master to clear those reactions for me? So statement 1, students arrive at UQ as self-regulated, independent learners who know what and how they study and how they want to engage in learning effectively. The laugh emoji, that's great. Yeah, that's probably my choice. Oh, thank you. Great, and a diversity of responses there. I say there's no correct answer here. We're really just giving us a chance to think about some aspects of universal design for learning that we need to consider. Yeah, thanks, Lorna. I agree. There are students who arrive, you know, with a really good understanding of their learning needs and skills, particularly if they've come from another university environment in particular. But there really is quite a lot of diversity there. I agree, Dom. It's an ongoing challenge to work out how we're going to learn best in different environments. Great, let's move on to statement 2, and I'll get you to clear the reactions there as well. So statement 2, students arrive at UQ with a formal diagnosis. And in this case, we're speaking specifically, for example, about a disability or a mental health condition. And they then also have a good understanding of their learning needs in regard to that diagnosis. A little bit of an extension of activity 1. Yeah. Great. And again, some of our students may arrive at university with a diagnosis, but they're moving to a new learning environment. Many of our students receive or pursue a diagnosis once they're at university. remembering too, we're talking about temporary disabilities or things that can impact on a student's ability to learn from semester to semester, so it can change. Let's move on to statement 3. My favorite, personally. Thank you especially to Linda and some of the other co-hosts for contributing to these. Inclusion means making sure all of our students' learning needs and preferences are met all of the time. Yeah, thanks, Lorna. Well, this would certainly be the dream. I would love to be able to do that for all of my students all of the time. It's probably unachievable. So we want to be realistic about what we can do and where we can make improvements over time. Yeah, thanks, Luke. And how we're supporting students to work it out for themselves over time in a scaffolded way. Fabulous. Okay, let's move to the final statement. Making sure our classes, our classroom teaching, our resources are accessible and inclusive means starting again, redesigning our whole course. And sometimes it can feel like that, that it's a lot of work or that we have to make a lot of change, but really we're encouraging small incremental changes over time. And of course, there are opportunities sometimes to redesign a whole course or a whole session, and then we can return and think more about inclusive design when we do that, but small incremental change is certainly more manageable. Thank you, and thanks for your participation. I might pause there. And again, I'll get you to share in the chat what aspects of that activity make it more inclusive or more easy for you to participate. But are there any considerations that would, by doing an activity like this, we might also be limiting participation or accessibility? So I'll pause here to reflect on how this activity has either encouraged or reduced participants' ability to participate, and feel free to share those thoughts in the chat. Thank you, Patrice. Yeah, thanks, Dom. It's a low risk way to engage. I really like starting most of my tutorial sessions with something low risk like this. It's kind of a warmer, but we don't have to turn our mics on, and we all know, you know, everyone joins late or they're taking their time to find all of the buttons, so it can be a super low stakes way to get participation. Thank you. And Chris has flagged that in reality, there are absolutely some people who would not be able to participate in that activity if it requires a mouse or they need to be able to see the screen. So depending on who's in your group, it's important to know that this activity wouldn't work for everyone. Elise, thank you. Yes, they are very complex issues and they're not really true or false, which can be frustrating. And we didn't really allow, you know, reflection or rich discussion to really unpack that complexity. So I completely agree. I think if I was a participant, I would find that incredibly frustrating. So that's a really helpful point. Oh, there's such rich contribution in the chat. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, I agree, Linda. Thanks, Haida. Reading it out as well as being able to read it on the screen. Yeah, and I find some people don't find that helpful. Right, so thanks for those contributions. I can see we've got lots of really good ideas already. We'll move on now to a couple of presentations and I'll hand over to the next speaker. So I'd like to firstly thank Peter Rutherford. He's actually in the room today somewhere, I think. This data comes from Peter and some work he's been doing. I won't spend too long on it, but really directly related to the accessibility and disability aspects of today's presentation. Remembering, based on that slide I first started with, we're really thinking about diversity much more broadly than just disability, but it is still helpful to know a little bit about that state at UQ at the moment. So the next click, please. And then one more click. We might notice here, for example, that there has been quite a sharp increase in the number of registered students with a disability. That's partly related to the change in how disability is reported or the categories that are available. So that's important to remember. Next slide, please. Yeah, so we've had some changes in the categories. And we'll make these slides available and maybe Peter can share in the chat where this data has come from so you can kind of investigate further yourself if you like. Next slide, please. Thanks, Chris. There's a broad variety of types. You'll notice the large jump in mental health there. Again, that's partly about that being considered a category now. It wasn't before, and you can probably think of some other reasons why mental health is now more commonly reported or registered, in addition to the fact that it probably is going up and that students absolutely have more, there's an increase in mental health concerns. Next slide, please. Current state of our access plans and exam adjustments, really, I think, particularly if you're a course coordinator, if you feel like there has been an increase in those, then you would be right. There has been. And again, we don't have a chance for a rich discussion around what this means, but I think it's helpful to know. And I think we'll leave it at that. There's one more slide that we'll probably skip. Thank you, Chris. And then I'll hand over to, again, a reminder, disability or registered disability is really only one aspect of what we're considering when we design our learning. And now I'll hand over to Linda. We'll get into some practicals. Thank you. And thanks for your participation.
Thanks, Amber. Thanks, John. So in simple terms, what I wanted to do was just talk a bit about how we move from relatively passive student engagement to a more active student engagement. And I could spend all day talking about this, so this will be a bit of a whiz through, but I'm really happy to chat to people afterwards about how we can improve practice. Thanks, John. And the reason I think this is important comes out of a lot of the work that I did in the mental health field. I used to work in community mental health. And one of the things that we realized very early on is that for people to have a sense of belonging, which we know is so integral to learning, we know it's integral to well-being, they can't get a sense of belonging unless they're first participating. And we know they can't participate if they're not actually present. Now, by present, I don't just mean in the classroom. It could be present to other learners. It might be present to the material, present to themselves in the sense of having time to actually think about what they're doing. But anyone who isn't present can't participate, and you can't feel a sense of belonging if you're not participating. Thanks, John. And I really like the thinking of Erich Fromm, who argues that we have two ways of being in the world. On one hand, we can think about what we have, and on the other hand, we can think about what we're being. And he argues that obviously Western society, being quite materialistic, is very much centered on what we have. And unfortunately, we do a really good job of conveying that to our students. So we place an emphasis on getting into university and being enrolled in a course and having a seat in the classroom and having access to readings and having the PowerPoint slides or a lecture recording, and then what GPA they're going to get and what job they're going to get, what degree they're going to get. And all of that is very much an emphasis on having rather than what they're actually doing in the moment. And instead, we might be thinking about, well, what is it we want our students to be? And there'd be a whole heap of qualities here. So when I think about my students, I want them to be curious and critical and experienced and hopeful. I want them to be ethical. And the path between having and being is participation. It's what do you actually do that creates all of those in the moment. Thanks, John. I think it's interesting because often when we talk about student access plans, what students read is that I will have access to a lecture note, or I will have access to PowerPoints, I will have access to a recording. And we need to understand that that's simply a resource. That's not the same as actually using those. All we're able to do through a student access plan is guarantee equitable access to education. What students then do with that is then on them. So my question is, well, if we're talking about participation, does it always have to look like this? And I think many of us would be aware that our models of participation are very Western. They're often very competitive and individualistic. They're very masculine. They're very extroverted. They're often very verbal. And for many people, whether we're talking about people who come from different cultures or people with different disabilities or just people with different preferences, that can be quite overwhelming. And yet for many of us, we're actually designing class activities and even our rubrics with this extroverted model in mind. So I guess I just want to push gently back on that this morning and ask what the alternatives might be. Thanks very much. What do I mean by very Western? I guess I'm thinking about white Anglo-centric models in particular. There'd be other cultures, of course, but I compare that to some of the non-Anglo cultures who perhaps have a much less visible way of participating, or certainly a less visible, less preference for that. So just quickly in the chat, what I'm going to ask you is, what are all the ways that you participate? And I'm thinking here in a learning moment or in a work moment rather than just socially. So how do you participate? Great, so asking questions, listening actively, thinking rather than daydreaming and processing. Any other ideas? Reading, talking. Yeah, sharing resources. I love that one. The idea that how you participate is to say, hey, have you seen what I've seen? Making something together, making notes, talking out loud. That's fantastic. Thank you very much. John, next slide. You're doing a great job, John. Thank you. So here's my question to you. All of us, nearly all of us, thank you very much, Andrew, but nearly all of us have turned off our cameras. So how does a participant, how as a presenter, do I know that you're participating right now? I lose control of the chat. Thanks, Luke. Chat responses. Yep. So we've set it up so that this is chat. So reactions. Hope. Thanks, Amber. Okay. So people staying in the session. Thank you, Ben. Yes, there's nothing worse than as a presenter, as we all know, than watching the numbers dropping madly. Yeah, so this is the challenge when it's feedback, when the anonymous feedback is set up, then whilst that might make people more comfortable, it's really hard to know if we have the one person participating multiple times or if we have many different people. Thank you. Yeah, post-session quizzes, great ideas. All right, thanks, John. I keep trying to move the slide. So here's my question. What helps you to participate? And Andrew, I guess you've started that. It's hard if it's not personal. So having a personal way to engage would be important. What helps you to participate? Time to think, yeah, which we're not giving you a lot of this morning, Rhona. Safe space, great, interest. Fantastic. So there's a few here that are about having multiple ways to participate. So the importance of having a choice in how you participate. And there's a lot of emphasis here on how it feels, whether it feels safe, whether it's okay to say the wrong things. Clear instructions, yes. Thanks, John. My last question's for you. If that's what helps us feel comfortable, then what's going to help other people participate? What principles or practices might we draw on? And I think you've started listing some of them. So yeah, Debbie, absolutely. Open-ended, nuanced questions. So that when people participate, thanks, Chris, you actually are using their contributions. Not just kind of leaving them sitting there. asking them what helps them to participate. Gosh, I know you've read my subtext. Low risk, minimal consequences. Fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone. Feedback, yes, and that feedback can sometimes be more responsive or less. So I'm just going to give you my top 6 suggestions. And if we have more time later, as we said in our later on in the year, we might do a much more intensive version of this. So I'm just going to share my top 6. So the first one is I always start by making generous assumptions. So when people aren't participating, what's the most generous assumption I can make about that? So if I've got 40 students sitting in my classroom, there's a fair chance that one of them's dog's dying, or somebody's got a family member who's really unwell, someone's cat's vomited during the night. There's a lot of animal themes you'll hear going on here. They've got problems at home, they're arguing with their partner, they've got money worries. There's a whole heap of reasons that we just find it difficult to turn up. And for some students, just being present was the most they're able to do today. And for them, that's a massive accomplishment. So I try as hard as possible not to take it too personally. Thanks, John. The second one is role modeling. So I always say, go hard or go home. And what I mean by that is anything I ask my students to do, I do louder and bigger and more of than I ask them. So I even get my students to sing in one of my classes. And so I sing solo before they sing as a choir. So anything, if I'm asking them to do an assignment, I do the assignment and I put up my example on Blackboard. So if I'm asking them to make a video, I'll do a video clip. Do I do requests? Thanks very much. Yeah, you may not want that. I didn't say it was a good effect. Thanks, John. 3, start slow, safe and low. So that's not you. As I said, as a teacher, you want to go loud and proud. For our students, and this has come up already, start as gently as you possibly can. Start low risk, start very gently, and do that and think about it across the class. How are you scaffolding it across the hour or 2 hours you've got together? How are you scaffolding it across the course or across the 13 weeks? How are you slowly building up the amount of risk taking that students are taking? And how do you build up across the program? So between the students that I teach in first year and the students I teach in fourth year, I have very different expectations of their participation levels. And I will ask them to do, I will never ask my first years to sing. However, I have no problem asking my third years to sing because they've been around long enough to know that they get asked to do all sorts of crazy things. So what we're asking also depends where students are up to as well. Thanks, John. Go 3D, this is one of my favorites. Again, I could talk about this all day. What this means is anytime there's a chance to have a 2-dimensional representation of something, make it 3-dimensional. So if I'm ever showing matrices in a graph, I have so much string. I wander around with balls of string all the time, and I immediately hand out string to my students and I get them to represent it physically in class. I get them to stand up, hold bits of string, hold different ends of a continuum, move around. So I'm always asking myself, is there more that I can do than just show it? How do I get them to actually embody it? Because it's that idea of learning living in the muscle. Also remembering that our classes are 3D spaces. So getting students to move around the space. And I know in our previous session, there was a message about being safe so students can stay in the same place and stay with the same students, giving them that option, but also giving students to explore as well and to express themselves in space. Some students need that as well. Thank you. Think roles. So often this is what I do with my very, very shy students. I have many students, about 75% of my students would not be Australian in one of my classes, not Australian born or English as first language. And a number of them are very reluctant to participate. And I think a lot of that is about fear of getting things wrong or fear of not using English correctly. And so what I do is I deliberately think about what are the roles that can help them show they're participating in gentle ways. So last semester, I had a student who was just a brilliant IT, and I'd get them to set up the PowerPoint at the start of every class. I have name badges. I've been literally sitting here this morning and getting my name badges ready for the next semester. And so I get students to be responsible for handing out the name badges or for being the resource person. It sounds very kindergarten, but what it's doing is helping people feel comfortable in the environment and giving them a clear role and clear instructions about how they can actually engage. Thanks, John. And finally, mix it up. And this is probably a good intro to your session, John. So this simply means, as we've said, having choice is really important. It's not always possible, but across everything we do, trying to think about what are all the mediums, what are all the vehicles I can use. So for my first year assessment, I make sure one of the items is written, one is spoken, and one is a visual piece, because I want to give students a chance to use whatever they feel comfortable in. Now, it means that everyone's going to be uncomfortable at some point in the semester, but it does also mean that everyone's going to have a safe space to contribute as well. As I said, could talk more. Over to you, John.
And I love this slide of all the different pictures, Linda. So
oh, I'd forgotten I put that one in. Yes.
Yep.
So this was my last question, sorry, which was just challenging ourselves to think about what are the types of participation that students are actually going to need to meet their learning objectives. So I might want them to all be, you know, putting their hands up in class, but if that's not necessary, why would I do it? So thinking about, are there other ways I can get them to participate that will still allow them to meet the learning aims? Thinking about what are the behaviours or artifacts that I can observe that tell me that students are participating? Thinking about how I can communicate those expectations to our students in much the way that we're trying to do here. And thinking about participation as a skill that needs developing over time, rather than just a state of being that students are choosing. Now, thanks, John.
Okay, it's my turn. So thank you, Linda. So I'm going to be speaking more specifically about the principle of Universal Design for Learning, or UDL. I'll start with one of my favorite cartoons. I think many of you may have seen this before. So I think the monkey's looking pretty good. The others, how do we design for them? So Universal Design for Learning, as the name suggests, it's designing for everyone in mind. It's not just about the academic high flyers and the students at the other end who may be struggling. It's everyone, and it's really all about simply reducing barriers and increasing access. The concept of Universal Design for Learning actually comes from architecture and design of physical spaces. So if you think of a ramp outside a building, it's obviously there or designed to reduce barriers for people who have mobility issues, but at the same time, it does increase access. So if you're tired and you don't want to walk up the stairs, well, there's the ramp. And if you have a stroller with small children, obviously the ramp helps as well. Likewise, if you're coming out of the automatic doors at Coles or Woolworths on the weekend to go into the car park, again, it reduces a barrier for those who have mobility issues, but at the same time, it's increasing access for us without a disability. So if you've got all your shopping bags, both hands, and you've got kids and all sorts of things, those automatic doors are actually very handy. So if we think about it in terms of our classes and our cohorts, I think we've seen enough in this session to know that it's a lot more than just students who have a disability. We have so many different groups, and I've just named a few here. So we've mentioned the life needs, the students who are working. It's amazing every time I speak to a student and I find out the jobs they're doing at the same time. I really don't know how they fit it in, to be honest. We've got parents in our cohorts. We've got our commuters. So we've got to think about, and I've seen this on the bus, students going through their learning materials on their mobile phone. So how do we cater for that? Maybe because it's really the only time they can really get in some quality time to look at resources in your course and the remote learners. And then there's the learning needs, and we know a lot about our international students, and for them English is a second language, but also we have different personalities in our classrooms, and we saw that in the pre-survey. I think we've got some extroverts. I think we've got some introverts, people who like to sit and reflect on things and process it. We've got people who really want to collaborate. So how do we accommodate all these different learners in our classroom? And so Universal Design for Learning comes from CAST, which you can find simply at cast.org. It comes up with 3 main principles. The first is providing the multiple means of engagement. How do you engage with your students? How do you motivate them to learn? Secondly, as Linda mentioned in her final tip, how do we represent the content in our courses? And thirdly, how do we provide different ways for our students to express their learning, to demonstrate the learning objectives in your course? So I've got some examples, obviously not an exhaustive list, but if we go through some of them that I'm familiar with in economics from where I work, ways we can engage with students, obviously providing real world examples and applications, making the learning relevant to their story. Now, recently I read an assignment from a first year economics student who had to write about opportunity cost and comparative advantage in their life. And this student wrote about being a part-time manager at KFC and making decisions about who makes the Zinger burgers, how many Zinger burgers they make, who's working on the fries, who's working on the drinks. I didn't realize there was so much decision making at KFC. But this student was able to demonstrate opportunity cost and comparative advantage as economic concepts in their world. And it made perfect sense. Give the students choice. How do they want to engage? How do they want to participate? Do they like group work, or do they prefer to work individually, or both? Differentiated activities. We have a course in economics where the students come along and they choose from 3 colors where they want to go for that tutorial. Now, green, the color green, is a group where these are students who really feel on top of the content, and so they may want some extension activities. In the middle, there's blue, and these students are sort of going okay, probably needs a little bit of an explanation, some consolidation activities. And then the third group is yellow, where the students are, not quite on top of it. And then maybe it's because they had to work extra hours that week. We don't know, but they want a little bit more guidance. So that's how we differentiate activities in that particular group. Self-reflection. The example of the economics one just said about KFC, that's also self-reflection as well. Well, think about it in your world. In terms of representation of content, I think that the default is the lecture slides with a lot of text. It's very much a print text culture in some ways, but here we are in a multimodal world. So how can we represent content in different ways which engage students? So I'll be giving some examples in a moment, but obviously learner control media, where students actually can pause, stop, rewind, chunking the content into bits rather than giving them this huge narrative which they have to scroll all the way through. Even the rubrics you present for your assessment, it gives the students another view of how that assessment is meant to look like. It's another representation. Glossary of terms. Don't assume that students know all the terms or what comparative advantage means necessarily because they learnt that in a first year course. You may have to give them a bit of revision through glossary. You can represent things in different ways visually, like in a Padlet and concept maps and infographics. And then with expressing the learning objectives and their learning, well, we have various assessment types. Obviously, exams are not for everyone. I've seen examples where students do not perform well in the exam, but if you give them another mode to demonstrate the learning objectives of the course, for example, make a podcast, you can see they can do that extremely well. So it's something to keep in mind. Now, just to give some specific examples in economics, in our postgraduate courses, we have an overwhelming number of international students, and they love the captions in videos and the transcripts, and they love to download them. So we give them that facility. The response has been overwhelming as far as the benefit it gives those students. So even something next week, like, or in week 1, when you have a Zoom meeting, you can turn on the captions like we've done for this particular session. Some students will really appreciate that. Images, very simple. And also having a look at how does it look like on the mobile. So when they're on the bus and they're scrolling through, now most of our platforms transfer quite nicely to mobile, but it'd be good to check. Now, just log in on your mobile phone and see what the content looks like. Again, images, diagrams. You can find a lot of YouTube videos which have already got the principles of UDL in them. Artwork. This is an economics course, but here we have art from China. And again, so another way of representing what's happening in the Chinese economy. And of course, if you've got maths in your course, you can break that down. And this is one of my favorites. And as it says here, ordinary least squares regression. I've got no idea what that means, but it's explained visually. So getting students to do things and make conclusions about how things change, etc. So just speeding up a little bit, I'm going to go straight to a quick reflection. In terms of next week or week 1, what are some of the things you can do straight away in your first class or in your first week? You might like to put some of those ideas down in the chat.
We'll have an activity for that later, John.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, we'll move quickly across. So over to you, Jason.
Thank you very much, John. Something I should mention straight away before I forget about it, there's actually a ton of crossover between what I'm doing and what John's doing. Yeah, we'll get to that and I'll explain it in a moment, but I just wanted to reinforce that there's actually quite a lot of crossover. So my name's Jason. I'm from the library and I call myself the accessibility and learning support team, but there's really just me. So if you email that address on there, you'll get me answering. Can we go to the next slide, please, John?
What I was going to say is that unless
Okay, so here are, or rather, I thought about how to present. You know, if we're going to present some quick wins that you can have in accessibility, what sort of things should we talk about? Obviously, we can't talk about everything in 10 minutes. So what should I do? Well, I thought what we'd do is we pick on PowerPoints and we pick on the way that we present them. And we talk about a few basic things that you can do in presenting a PowerPoint. So see if you can guess which things I'm going to highlight in this presentation, or rather in this 10 minutes. Could you go to the next slide, please, John? Now, if you were less kind than some people might be, you would have known that that was a profoundly ugly slide and very user unfriendly. What I did for it was I actually went to the accessibility LibGuide that we have in the library. And it has a checklist at the end of all kinds of things that you can run through to see whether you've made an accessible resource. But, oh, thanks, Amber. I've also put a link to that on the Padlet that everyone has access to, so you can get to it quite easily. I took screenshots of that precisely so that I could show you why taking screenshots of something and putting it in a PowerPoint is actually quite a bad idea. And the first and primary reason for that is there's a phrase that gets used quite a lot, that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So you put a picture up on your PowerPoint, and the first thing that you should be thinking is, well, what if you can't actually see the image? It might be worth 1,000 words, but if you can't see it, then you can't access any of them. So how can we think about how to make those slides a little more accessible? Well, thinking about the slide that I just showed you, here are some basic things. So if this slide was being used within a live lecture, probably not too bad because you could explain it at the time. But imagine your students are looking at it after your lecture. They open it up, they're trying to figure out what you've just, what you've explained to them. That has absolutely no contextual information, no understanding of what the key elements are that you're supposed to be taking away from it. I think, yeah, the text is just a block with little guide to interpretation. So there's nothing to really explain what they should get. And all I've done is put a red circle around the main points that I want you to get. I haven't told you that, but I've added them, I've put them there, but I haven't actually considered what might happen to people who have vision issues with color, whether or not they can actually see them. Sorry, so could you go to the next slide, please, John? So imagine you were to try and actually rebuild that slide. Well, the first thing you should do, and this is where I just realized that this has a lot of crossover with John, is the first thing you want to do is you want to think holistically. You want to think about what it is that you want the people to actually take away from looking at this PowerPoint or at this PowerPoint presentation. You want to think about the story you're telling and what you want them to get from it. So the first thing you should do, I think, these are the 5 things that I had, the 5 things plus a subpoint that I had circled on the screenshot. First thing you should add is alternative text. Probably all familiar with it by now. Anytime you go on the internet and highlight over it and put your cursor hovering over a picture, it'll have a little, well, it should have a little piece of text pop up. That's called alt text. Basically in PowerPoint, this is the same in Word and a whole lot of Microsoft products. But in PowerPoint, you can right click on an image and it'll give you the option to add alt text to it. That means that when people are looking at this afterwards, if they're using a screen reader because they can't read everything directly, so they need the computer to read it out to them. It tells the screen reader what that image actually is. So if you don't put alt text on there, all it will do is it will tell them that there's an image there. If they have no idea, if they can't see it, then they have no idea whether that image is important, whether they should know about it, whether it's decorative, whether it's something that's profoundly important to what's being told to them. So that's where you have alt text as an opportunity to actually give that little explanation. Thinking also about screen readers or continuing to use it, have you used tags and styles in your documents? And this is often a bigger issue. I said we're talking about PowerPoint, but this is a bigger issue for all kinds of documents, really. And I've just mentioned it because it's a bit of a bugbear of mine because it's such an easy thing to do. And yet so few people seem to think about it. When you do, say, a Microsoft Word document, you don't, people will try and format it by hitting the enter button over and over again, or by hitting the space bar over and over again. They won't realize that you can actually work around in the background to structure how you want your text to look, how you want the spacing between words, between letters in words, between paragraphs, all kinds of things like this. And you can generate a table of contents out of that. And the good thing about it is if you do it in, say, Microsoft Word, and then you export it as PDFs for your students, all of that work crosses over. So that helps people with screen readers, that helps, well, helps everybody really, helps them understand the structure of the document that they're looking at, helps them to move around in it. Now, this is true of everything, but for the sake of PowerPoints, think also about how you emphasize information. So in the ugly slide that I had a moment ago, all I've done is put a red circle around things that I wanted everyone to see. Well, if you're, say, if you've got vision issues that stop you from actually seeing the contrast properly between the colors, the gray background and the red that I've used to highlight it, then that's not actually going to be very clear to you. But if you're doing what I've done here and you're restructuring your, yes, absolutely, Tim, thank you for mentioning that. If you're structuring it as this rather than a screenshot, you can use bold to, as I've done with the phrase think holistically, you can use bold to emphasize things rather than using italics. Potentially, it's better to use neither of them, but if you do need to do something to highlight something, bold is better because it helps differentiate it from the words around it that are going to be much more easily understandable for people who have, I won't list all the issues, but learning disorders like dyslexia, dyscalculia, things that interfere with their reading and their capacity to distinguish between letters and things. Similarly, use sans serif fonts like Arial or Verdana. There is, and the checklist, sorry, not the checklist, the LibGuide that we have that Amber posted earlier, that's also on the Padlet. It mentions a font called Dyslexie or Open Dyslexia. They're actually fonts that are designed for dyslexic people, but there has been some research done around the usefulness of that font. And what people mention, or what the research has shown, is that in a lot of cases, Arial or Verdana can work just as well if you actually think about how you space the letters inside words, which again goes back to the issue of using styles and formatting in your document. If you create enough space between the letters in a word and then between the words themselves, you can actually make it much more readable, much more accessible for a lot of people who might not be very good at following the letters in a word. If you have serifs, and this is an easy problem to do if you haven't thought about this before, serif fonts such as Times New Roman can make things very, very easy to read when it's printed out on paper for particular kinds of people. But if you're dyslexic, it can make it very, very hard to differentiate between the letters. And this is actually kind of a deliberate problem because serif fonts are actually designed to create continuity between the letters. But once you get somebody come along with vision issues, that connection between letters can stop them from actually being able to differentiate between them. And the final issue I want to mention is use the accessibility checker in the software, almost any piece of software. And I know this is definitely the case for everything in Microsoft Word and in Microsoft Office. It's also the case in PDF, in Adobe. They'll actually run through a lot of the basics for you and actually draw your attention to the issues that you're not aware of. So it's definitely worthwhile having that running when you're finishing your documents. Next slide, please, John. Okay, so hopefully that was a little bit helpful, but I've actually added the 3 links that I've got in here to the Padlet as well for everybody. There's the LibGuide that I mentioned at the top there. Census Access is actually a tool that the library provides for the conversion of, Census Access is a application that allows you to convert from one format to another. So for instance, a lot of people use it to convert PDFs to Word documents because that allows them to do more work with the contrasting of the colors, with the font styles, things like that. But other things that it can do that are quite brilliant, it can convert PDFs, it can convert entire books to MP3s, and it doesn't take very long. It depends upon the complexity of the document, but basically it lets people put it on their phones and listen to it as an audio book rather than having to read through the document. So it's a huge issue. And we also have a Workday course that was designed by my manager, Luke Gator. So if you click on it, here's the contact name. It's basically a course to help you run through the awareness of the accessibility issues and the matters that you should be thinking about as you go along. Thank you. We've got questions coming up, so feel free to ask any come to mind. I didn't actually know that. Thank you, Tim. Yeah, and this is, oh, sorry, I forgot to mention, we also have assistive technology rooms. Primarily, these are only available for students who have SAPs who come through student services, but what we actually do is we provide them with specialized software. So we do provide, what's the phrase? We provide the sort of state-of-the-art technologies. So Dragon, which is speech to text, which does speech recognition, so that students who have issues with mobility, with typing, with with reading, it enables them to dictate their assignments rather than write them out. It also, that piece of software enables people to also control their computers by voice, so it can be very helpful. We offer a lot of, we offer software which enables magnification of text and things, so students can bring along their own materials and run it on the computer. They can bring along books and scan them in. So it's definitely worth recommending. If you have any SAP students, just remind them, their student advisors should mention this to them as well. But if you have any who are having problems, just remind them to get in touch with us, and we might be able to help them out with their resources and formatting of readings and things. Thank you very much. Next slide. Thanks, John.
Great. Thank you, Jason. That was really informative. Yeah, just like John was saying before in this reflection activity, what we'd like you to do now is to access the Padlet. The link's in the chat there, or there's a QR code on the screen, and use the plus button next to one change you have in mind to share one thing you're thinking about doing in week one change you're thinking about in your slides or your resources or your content, or the way you teach your class. So just in that top section, one change you have in mind.
Chris, are you able to put a direct link to the Padlet in chat? A few people are struggling.
Yes,
to get
it is in chat.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. It's the same one you've already put up.
Yes, that's right.
Thank you.
Sorry if that wasn't clear.
Yep, they're all joining now. You can see at the top of the Padlet.
Yep. Yeah, so there's an example there, maybe what we'll learn this week, just to get students a bit more motivated. And if you like someone else's post, please feel free to use the like feature. Explicit about the why. Oh, I like that one. Signposting why we're looking at a particular topic and relevance in the real world. Start slow. Yes, one of Linda's great tips. Revising flow of information, how points are emphasized. Excellent. Asking the students what they prefer in terms of activities. Oh yeah, I like that too. I recently heard someone's idea that they do a little survey in week 3, I think, where they ask their students, anonymously, how's the course going so far? And he's had some really interesting feedback about he talks, that he was talking too fast in class, things like that. We all get nervous. So he's had he's modified his approach to teaching, and it's had much better results for the students. Relate to real world example application. Great. Yep. Self-reflection. And that, the self-reflection and self-assessment, that's something we can really get into a bit more in the teaching and learning week session in November, when we'll have a bit more time to really think about how to refresh courses and assessment structure. Fonts on the slides and handouts, great. And again, if you use the standard UQ template, it has basically smart defaults for those accessibility needs. Name tags. Oh, I like that. Terrible with names. Seeing and using names make connection easier for me and students. I like, I think Jason Lodge was, he said in an earlier session a few months ago how he uses the, there's a feature where you can get a class list of student photos and uses that to memorize names. And he said the students are just shocked when he says, "Oh, Fred, please tell us more." And they're like, "How do you know my name?" I don't think they're creeped out. I think they find it really, really engaging. That's great. Yeah, turning on captions in meetings, excellent. Well, that's really great. Thank you for that. Some really nice suggestions, really nice ideas, and I hope we all get to play with those and try those out. We might go back to the slides if that's okay, John, and just the next slide. So just quickly, I just thought it might be nice to just go through some of the UDL principles that we use today, that you've seen in action. And hopefully you noticed at the start that we really worked hard to emphasize the relevance, and we really worked hard to try and get some personal sharing and responses, and John provided some nice exemplars and learner support tools, and they're all about means of engagement. For representation, again, we're leaning on John he provided some lovely analogies and metaphors, and we put a lot of thinking into how to chunk this into smaller parts. And part of that is we thought a lot about what can people do, the week before O week, and how much can they achieve, and how much can we think about later on when we get to really refresh our courses. And for the multiple means of action and expression, I think Amber did a lovely job of providing some guidance about how to do the yes, no, and with the reactions, and we had a sort of a safe trial run for using the tool, and later on we'll in the Padlet, if you look down lower, we've got an example of a lesson plan template, and also an example from this session. So it's the top one of the inclusive resources there, John. So feel free to use that to think about how to make your classes a little more, how to design a little bit more, using the types of learning from Dinah Lorillard. There's acquisition, collaboration, discussion, investigation, practice, and production. And there's links to describing what they all mean. And the example of this session shows how we did those and how those types of learning align with this particular lesson. We were hoping for a little bit of a QA, but we've only got 3 minutes left before we get kicked out. So John's just put up the slide with feedback, and I think we might just put that someone can put that in the chat, I will try, but I think we've got someone probably beat me to it. Yeah, thanks, John. And I guess, are there any, before we leave, would anyone like to put their hand up and ask a particularly burning question they have?
Chris, there's one question in the chat I thought was worth talking to from Lorna about whether there's a service to review the course from an accessibility perspective. Maybe you could talk to that.
Yeah, there are learning designers in all faculties. Some are more well staffed than others. But if you get to know the learning designer in your area, that's something we can do. Jason, is that part of the library's services?
We can definitely go through resources and help with that, but not the overall course content.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and again, the one of the lovely things about what the library does is you guys go to a lot of trouble to make sure that the resources are accessible. If it's in the reading list instead of being uploaded as a PDF, for example.
Yeah, we can alter things to fit into whatever formats the students need. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you. Any other questions? Or comments? Oh, and Tim shared a link to for easy checks for accessibility. Thank you for that. Great, thank you. Yeah, so it's 10:02, and I think it's the time that we're supposed to clear the space for the next session. So thank you very much for joining us. And again, I encourage everybody to come onto campus if you can for the in-person sessions tomorrow. So thank you. And
Thank you, everyone.
To our presenters.
Thanks, everyone.
Amazing.
Yeah, thanks, team.
Thank you.
Great job. See you soon.